Welcome to the Baptist Reformation, where we do the work of recovering the Reformation in Baptist thought. Thank you for joining us. And welcome to the Baptist Reformation. Just kidding. We say Baptist in these parts. Today it's just an exciting time. Let me just say that. I'm ecstatic because we're actually going to start our Doctrine of God series. And the Doctrine of God is my favorite subject because it's so foundationally important to the rest of our doctrine, really, and our lives as Christians. When we have the Doctrine of God wrong, we get a lot of things wrong afterwards. So, get your Doctrine of God wrong, you'll get your soteriology wrong. You get your Doctrine of God wrong, you could get your Doctrine of Scripture wrong. You get your Doctrine of God wrong. All these things flow out of a proper understanding of the one true God of the universe. And so it's really important to talk about, which is why I am starting this series. I'm also going to be helping to teach this subject to Sunday school students at my church, or Sunday school students, I say, really like 70% of the congregation, because we're a very small church family. But myself, John Young, who writes for the Baptist Reformation, will be teaching, and a couple other brothers. I hope, guys, you don't mind if I mention your names, but Conrad and Jared. And the four of us will be kind of working through the Doctrine of God using question number 7 and answer to that question of the Baptist Catechism, found in the back of your leather-bound Baptist confession that you can find on Solid Ground Christian Books. So it's very important. The Doctrine of God is very important, and that's why we as a church even are going to be working through it, because it's very, very important to at least get what we can know about God right. We can never know God exhaustively as creatures. We're finite, but what we can know of God, we need to know accurately. We need to have true factual knowledge of who God is, at least according to his revelation, what we can know of him. So that said, and that directly leads us into our starting point, really, in talking about the Doctrine of God, is divine incomprehensibility. Sounds like a big word, big term. It's very simple, which is going to be our next topic. Divine simplicity will be our next episode, so stay tuned for that. But divine incomprehensibility just means that we cannot, I guess if you were to say it in be a negativa or a negative way, God cannot be comprehended by us creatures. And what do I mean by that? Comprehended. Some of us may be used to using the term comprehend in the context of knowing, of having knowledge of. Really, that's not how I'm using the term here. I'm using the term of comprehension or comprehending. I'm using in the sense of being able to get our arms around God. We cannot get, if you could picture a tree, and think about how hard it is to get your arms around a tree. You can't do it if it's a big tree. You can't get your arms around it. And so that's kind of the idea behind it. I can't get my mind around God. I can't fit God into my mind such that I can know everything about him. He cannot be comprehended by the human intellect in either a qualitative or quantitative way. And what do I mean by that? Well, I can't know every fact there is to know about God. God is infinite, and we will always be learning about God. But I also can't know God in a one-to-one correlative sense, or what we might call a univocal sense. I can't know God like I know my coffee mug. I can't know God like that. Our knowledge, our talk about God is analogical. And we'll get into that more when we talk about simplicity in the next episode. But I do want to start by making a distinction between comprehension and apprehension. If we could think of apprehension, if comprehension is getting our arms or our mind around something, apprehension is learning something about what we often try to get our minds or our arms around. So rather than being able to comprehend God, I can't do that. I can know something of God because God has disclosed himself to us by way of his revelation. So I can apprehend facts about God, and those are known in an analogical way, and we'll discuss that later. But I cannot comprehend God in the sense that I can know all there is to know about God in either a qualitative or quantitative way. So that's important, that we can know God as God's creatures because he's revealed himself to us, but we shouldn't get carried away and start thinking that we can know everything there is to know about God. I know that one area in which this issue often arises is in the discussion concerning the lapsarian views, for example. That debate often gets complicated, and on some level it's very, very important, the way in which we order God's decrees, right? But at another level, there is mystery there that we simply cannot get out of God, so to speak. We cannot travel into the depths of God's mind or fathom the mind of God to the point where we can know all there is to know about the knowledge of God, about what God knows, and about how God knows, and so on and so forth. So that's one example. But I will just kind of use the outline of, I want you guys to be able to use the blog posts that I do on each topic that we're going to be discussing here on the podcast and the video, the YouTube channel. So we're starting with divine incomprehensibility today, and then we're going to move on to simplicity, and we're going to move through God's attributes after that. The attributes that are listed out are outlined in question 7, answer 7 in our Baptist Catechism. And by the way, let me just read that for you real quick so that we have a kind of access point into this discussion, so that you know where I'm going. Question 7 is, what is God? God is a spirit, infinite, eternal, and unchangeable in his being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth. And so you might ask, well, there's nothing about incomprehensibility in that, explicitly anyway, so why are we starting with incomprehensibility? And then why are we going to simplicity afterwards? They don't say God is simple in the answer to question 7. Well, there's assumptions that the framers of both our confession and our catechism are making. And indeed, they do speak about things that certainly imply incomprehensibility. God's infinity, for example. If God is infinite, there's no way we can comprehend God. We're not infinite, we're finite. So if you just want to look at it at a very basic ontological or even an epistemological level, we cannot comprehend God. There is a creator-creature distinction that is there. So that's the question that we're going to be working off of. So to contextualize the discussion, I'm starting here at incomprehensibility, moving to simplicity, which is an assumption in the Catechism, and is actually mentioned in the confession. So, divine incomprehensibility. This is going to be a brief introduction. I hope that I can get through it in a reasonable amount of time. But But any systematic theology ought to start its discussion on God with divine incomprehensibility in one way or another. If we proceed upon the assumption that God can be comprehended, either in theory or in practice, we may end up rejecting certain orthodox tenets of the faith simply because we cannot seem to reconcile them according to our own personal powers of reason. And you see this happening in various corners or circles of evangelicalism. I can think of Dr. William Lane Craig's accessibilism, his Molinism, his Neo-Apollinarianism in relation to the incarnation, his social Trinitarianism. I mean, the list goes on with that guy, but that's one example, and there's a lot of followers of his thoughts. So it's important that we don't become mere rationalists about theology and say, well, if I can't understand it, or if I can't reconcile it, then I'm just going to have to throw it out and kind of figure out another way to understand that. And in that, we kind of put God into this meat grinder, so to speak, so that we can grind him down to our understanding, and then we can have little bits and pieces of him that seem more reconcilable to us. And that's just not a right way to do theology. And it's because we don't start with the presupposition, either practically or theoretically, with God's incomprehensibility, the presupposition that God is incomprehensible to us. So that's our presupposition in this series, that God is incomprehensible, that he cannot be comprehended by the creature. And I already discussed kind of the relationship of comprehending to knowing, and how there's a distinction between apprehension and comprehension. But let's think about something here as an example. We can think of a broad topic like mathematics. I know math, right? I know math. I can figure 2 + 2 = 4, or 3 × 9 = 27. But does this mean I comprehend math as a subject? Well, of course not. I don't comprehend math as a subject. I know math, but I apprehend certain things about math, but I do not comprehend math as a topic or as a subject. I can't even come close to successfully articulating equations in theoretical physics or the level of geometry used by structural engineers, for example. I know math, but I do not comprehend it as a subject. Even if I could do that high-level physics, high-level physical equations, or perform geometry like an engineer would perform it, I still wouldn't be able to comprehend math as a subject. I would have to know everything there is to know about math. We as humans, we cannot exhaust our knowledge in that way. We can know truths about God like this, but we cannot comprehend God exhaustively. So, what about even what we do know? And this kind of gets us into the conversation about analogical language and univocal language, and we'll get into that more as we progress in this series. But now that we've established that we can know things about God, and that God has disclosed himself to us, we must say something about this knowledge. What is the nature of this knowledge that we have? Our knowledge about the facts of God, we may call it propositional knowledge, is creaturely, fundamental. At a very fundamental level, our knowledge is creaturely. It's not, we don't have knowledge like God has knowledge. We do not know like God knows. God does not come to the facts in an intellectual sequence like humans do. For instance, I can know this coffee cup, but it's a process of learning about this coffee cup, right? I come to different facts about it in a logical sequence. For instance, I come to the fact that it has a handle I can grab onto. It's round. It participates in the universal of roundness, so to speak. There's some coffee dregs in the bottom of it because I finished my coffee, and there's a blue stripe above it. See, my knowledge works sequentially. I come to things in a process. God does not learn by way of process. God's knowledge is it's a simple act. God himself indeed is purus actus, or pure actuality. And so he does not learn via a process like we do as humans. So our knowledge fundamentally is different from God's knowledge, and we have to start there in this conversation. And this is building us up for our discussion on his attributes, on simplicity, especially when we get to it next time. So we must obtain knowledge. We must obtain knowledge as humans, and you see the problem there. You see that we have to obtain knowledge. God does not have to obtain knowledge. God, in virtue of who he is the perfection of knowledge. He is the very perfection of what we might call knowledge itself. He knows all things immediately without process. Another way we are different from God is that our experiences are creaturely, and our language is limited to creatureliness. So let me put it to you this way. Just think of it very, very practically here. Our experiences are different. First of all, having experiences presupposes that we come to facts, or that we experience things in the world, in the material universe. We experience this. We come to knowledge in some way of the world around us. God doesn't do that. That's not God. God doesn't experience things. So he also doesn't have. He's also not confined to thinking in terms of language. And when we as humans, we have to think in terms of kind of our language. I mean, we think in a process, but we also talk in a process. When I say God is something or God has something, I'm improperly speaking about God in a sense. I cannot even comprehend God in my language, because human predication, is such that it can't capture concepts without saying something about those concepts. So we don't have immediate language about things, a direct correlative language about things. We have to, especially about God, but we have to speak and think in a process. And that's the point I'm trying to get here. So if there's one thing you just took away from that little blurb of discussion, it's that we have to speak and think in a process. God does not. This is how we are different from God in the knowledge situation. So this sometimes people will walk away from this discussion, thinking we can't know anything about God. Then we can't know anything about God, at least in a quality sense. But we can, and we do have true knowledge about God. Here's one example. In Exodus 15:6, Moses writes, "Your right hand, O Lord, is majestic in power." We all know that God, who is not a physical body, does not literally have some material hand which stretches through space. But does Moses communicate something false about God here? Is Scripture wrong here in what it says? Or is he saying something true about God using anthropomorphic or analogical language? The latter must be the case, because we know Scripture is not wrong about anything. It's communicating truth to us. So when Moses ascribes a right hand to God, he's communicating something, a deeper concept to us, a deeper sense about God to the reader, than just merely the ultra wooden literal sense that God actually has this right hand out in space somewhere. I mean, that's ridiculous. But just because Moses says something that doesn't directly correspond to who God is according to his divine essence, that is, he ascribes a body part to God, doesn't mean he's not communicating truth about God. Indeed, he is. The author of Exodus is using concepts common in human experience to say something absolutely true about God, and that is that God is fundamentally powerful. We can say it another way, according to our doctrine of divine simplicity, that God is the very perfection of power. Sorry, I get excited about this stuff because it's very important that we understand it. There is, however, an even better way to talk about God. That is by the via negativa, or the negative way. I mentioned it earlier, but I didn't explain it. Speaking about God by way of negation, which is a form of apophaticism. This is the best way to speak about God if we're going to speak about God at all. It's even the best way to think about God. Indeed, our own confession engages in this. For example, rather than predicating something positive about God, thus adding to him in our language, we can say what he is not. Stephen Charnock does this in his Existence and Attributes of God. God is not comprehensible. God is not composed, referencing divine simplicity. God is not corporeal, etc., etc., etc. This is not to say that everything we say about God must be in the negative. Even Scripture says positive things about God. Take 1 John 4:8, for example. I believe that's God is light. But we can speak of God with more caution by way of negation. So it's a better way to talk about God if we say what he is not. Only because when we say God is something, that's technically an improper mode of speaking about God. Because God is, we have to say God. Okay, if I could just boil it down in the very basic sense, we have to say God, and then we have to pile something onto God, so to speak. So we have to say God plus something else. God is plus this attribute, right? God plus love. God plus power. God plus justice, or whatever we might be. Whatever attribute we might be referencing. Our language is very shaky when it comes to talking about God, and so to speak by way of negation is usually the best way to talk about God, unless we're referencing some divinely inspired scripture that actually does speak about God positively. God is light, for example. But that, keep in mind that that's also saying something of what God is not, right? God in John follows that up, in whom there is no darkness, right? There is no darkness in God. God is not darkness. God is light. If I could add another note concerning our language, when we talk and think about God, we must talk and think about God analogically rather than univocally, and that's something we'll get into with the simplicity discussion, I hope. Univocal language would suggest that our language directly corresponds to the infinite essence of the divine, like my language might correspond to this coffee cup or this microphone, that we can talk about God like that, and that is a position held by a lot of people within evangelicalism. It's just an assumption that God is just on the higher end of the sliding scale of being. He's just a more powerful being than we are. But we're not really getting to the real rub of the matter here, that God is wholly other. He is not creaturely. He is the creator. So we should talk about God analogically, not univocally, and think that we can talk about God in a one-to-one correlative sense. But our finite language cannot directly apply to the divine essence. That's just ridiculous to think that a finite thing, i.e. our language, could comprehend the divine essence. It just can't do it. It can't directly correspond to the divine essence like it might my keyboard, or my coffee cup, or the picture of myself and my wife on my desk here, which is a really good picture. I love that picture, by the way. I love my wife. She's the best. I may say, here's one example I could use. I may say my computer has a lot of memory, right? But a computer having a lot of memory and a human having a lot of memory are two different things, although related, okay? They're related because the language is borrowing categories from one and imposing it upon the other. So we're using the term memory in an analogical way when we talk about hard drive storage, right? We know what our memory is, and so we project that back onto a machine, i.e. a computer or hard drive storage. Man has created a machine that has something like human memory inside of it, but it's not human memory at all. It's just not. It's something different than human memory. That is, it is a digital file storage system, while human memory is a faculty of the human intellect. When we speak of God and say God's knowledge, we say and think about knowledge like we might think about our own. And this is to be expected because our knowledge is really the only thing we have experience of. The limitations of our experience force us to relate the knowledge of God to our own in some ways. But most, if not all, of us would agree that God's knowledge does not happen, quote unquote, like our knowledge happens. In other words, there is something like our knowledge in God, but it is not, fundamentally, it is not our knowledge. We should refrain from saying God's knowledge is really just a bigger, better knowledge than our own. That's not the case. God's knowledge is altogether not creaturely knowledge and does not fall within the scale of what constitutes greater or lesser creaturely knowledge. And now to wrap this up for you guys, I didn't want to go too far over time. We're about 5 minutes over. That's not a big deal. Just to close this up, this topic is one of the most important areas of theology. Okay, the doctrine of God is I'll say the most important locus of theology. The rest of our theology, including the simple gospel, will be affected by how we think and talk about God. If we go wrong here, we will go wrong everywhere else. We must understand that God, one, is not like us in the sense of being able to draw one-for-one correlations between his nature and ours, and two, we will never be able to mentally or linguistically comprehend the divine essence. If we start with the incomprehensibility of God, we will be preserved from error as we proceed in this study. We always have to keep this in mind, and that's important. So join me next time. Please, guys, join me next time for the discussion on divine simplicity. That'll be the next installment, and then we'll proceed from there onto the rest of the divine attributes. God is spirit, which will have a lot to do with our talk on simplicity. He's not made of a body. He's not composed of physical parts. He's spirit. Infinite, eternal, and unchangeable in his being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth. So that's what you have to look forward to. All right, guys. God bless. Have a good one.